The boy who would become Britain's most damaging Cold War traitor was not, strictly speaking, British at all. George Behar was born on the 11th of November 1922 in Rotterdam to Albert Behar, a Sephardic Jew who had acquired British nationality through service in the First World War, and Catherine Biedervellen, a Dutch Protestant. The household was comfortable, cosmopolitan, and linguistically tangled. Young George spoke Dutch at home, heard Spanish from his father's relatives, and carried a British passport that would prove in time to be the single most consequential document of his life. Albert Behar died in 1936, when George was 13. The boy was sent to live with relatives in Cairo, where his cousin, Henri Curiel, later a prominent communist organizer, exposed him to a strain of radical politics that Rotterdam's stolid bourgeoisie would have found incomprehensible. It is tempting to draw a straight line from Curiel's flat in Cairo to Blake's eventual ideological conversion, but the historical record does not support so neat a causation. What Egypt did provide was an early fluency in operating across cultures and an instinct for compartmentalization. George Behar learned to be one thing in one room and something quite different in the next. He returned to the Netherlands in 1940, just as the Wehrmacht rolled across the Dutch frontier. The German occupation confronted the 17-year-old with a binary that would have broken many adults. His father's Jewish heritage made him a target. His mother's Dutch connections offered a degree of cover. Rather than go to ground, Behar joined the Dutch resistance, working as a courier for an underground network that funneled intelligence to London. The work was unglamorous and extremely dangerous. Couriers were the most expendable link in any resistance chain. If caught, they were interrogated with the full repertoire available to the Sicherheitsdienst and then, typically, shot or deported east. Behar survived. The precise details of his resistance activities remain difficult to verify independently. Much of what is known comes from Blake's own later accounts, and he was never a reliable narrator of his own past. In 1943, he managed to travel overland through occupied Belgium and Vichy France, crossing the Pyrenees into Spain and eventually reaching Gibraltar. From there, the Royal Navy brought him to England. He was 20 years old, spoke accented but fluent English, and presented himself to the authorities not as George Behar, but under the beginnings of a new identity. By 1944, he had formally changed his surname to Blake, his mother's suggestion, taken from no particular source, and enlisted in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve as a sub-lieutenant. His wartime service was spent not at sea but in the Dutch section of the Secret Intelligence Service, working at its headquarters in Broadway Buildings, just off St. James's Park in London. SIS, then still operating under the formal cover designation of the Passport Control Office, was not an organisation known for rigorous vetting. It ran on class signals, personal introductions, and a general assumption that anyone who sounded right and had the right sort of war probably was right. Behar, now Blake, sounded right enough. The war ended. Blake, still only 22, had already accumulated an unusual portfolio: resistance work, a foreign upbringing, multiple languages, and direct experience of SIS operations. The service kept him on. He was sent to Hamburg in 1947 as part of the British intelligence effort to exploit the wreckage of the Third Reich, interrogating former U-boat commanders and piecing together what remained of the Kriegsmarine's operational records. It was routine, painstaking work, and Blake did it competently. His superiors noted his diligence, his facility with languages. He was by now adding Russian to his repertoire, studying at Downing College, Cambridge, on an SIS-funded course. And his apparent lack of vices. He did not drink to excess. He did not chase women conspicuously. He did not talk out of turn. In the culture of post-war, SIS, where alcoholism and indiscretion were practically institutional, George Blake looked like an exemplary young officer. Nobody in Broadway buildings, nor in the service's new headquarters at 2 Carlton Gardens overlooking the mall, appears to have paused over the obvious questions. A man with a changed name, a family history that spanned 4 countries and 3 religions, ideological exposure in wartime Cairo, a resistance record that could not be independently corroborated. In an organization that had recently harbored Kim Philby as its head of anti-Soviet operations, the failure to scrutinize George Blake was not an anomaly. It was the system working exactly as designed. In the autumn of 1948, SIS posted Blake to its station in Seoul, South Korea. The appointment was, on paper, unremarkable. He was attached to the British legation under Captain Vivian Holt as a vice-consul, the standard diplomatic cover for intelligence officers operating in remote stations where Britain maintained a watching brief, rather than any serious operational presence. His primary task was to develop networks capable of reporting on communist activity in North Korea, Manchuria, and the Soviet Far East. It was the kind of assignment given to promising junior officers, difficult enough to test competence, distant enough that failure would not embarrass London. Blake arrived in Seoul and set about learning Korean with the same methodical discipline he had applied to Russian at Cambridge. He recruited a small number of local agents and began filing reports back to Broadway buildings via the legation's cipher channel. The intelligence was modest, fragmentary observations on troop movements north of the 38th parallel, assessments of Soviet influence over Kim Il-sung's regime, but it was considered sound. Blake's personnel file for this period, fragments of which were later reviewed by the journalist and intelligence historian Gordon Carrera, contains consistently positive assessments from his station chief. He was, by every available metric, doing his job. Then, on the 25th of June 1950, the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel with approximately 135,000 troops, supported by 150 Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. The invasion caught the Western intelligence establishment almost entirely off guard. The CIA's reporting from the peninsula had been patchy. SIS's was scarcely better. Within 3 days, Seoul fell. Captain Holt made the decision not to evacuate the legation staff, calculating, wrongly as it transpired, that diplomatic immunity would offer some protection. Blake, along with Holt, the legation's commissioner, Herbert Lord, the French consul George Behar, and a number of other Western civilians, was taken into custody by the advancing North Korean forces. What followed was a captivity of extraordinary duration and brutality. The group was marched northward, first to Pyongyang, and then, as United Nations forces under General MacArthur counterattacked, further into the mountains near the Yalu River on the Chinese border. The conditions were appalling. Rations were minimal, often no more than a handful of millet or sorghum per day. Medical care was non-existent. Commissioner Lord died of untreated illness during the march. Several other civilian internees perished from malnutrition, dysentery, or exposure during the bitter Korean winter, where temperatures in the mountain camps dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. It was during this captivity, according to Blake's own account, given in his 1990 memoir, No Other Choice, that his ideological conversion occurred. He has stated that witnessing American aerial bombardment of Korean villages, the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure by B-29 superfortresses operating from bases in Japan, convinced him that the Western powers were engaged in an act of imperialist aggression. The suffering of Korean civilians, he claimed, shattered whatever residual attachment he held to the assumptions underlying British and American foreign policy. He approached his Soviet-assigned guards and offered his services to the KGB. This is Blake's version. It should be handled with considerable caution. Several of his fellow captives, including the diplomat Philip Dean, who published his own account of the internment, noted that Blake was subjected to extended private sessions with Soviet and North Korean intelligence officers during the captivity, sessions from which the other internees were excluded. Whether these sessions constituted a genuine ideological conversion, a coercive recruitment under duress, or some combination of the two, remains a matter of dispute among intelligence historians. What is not in dispute is the outcome. By the time the armistice was signed at Panmunjom on the 27th of July, 1953, and the surviving internees were repatriated, George Blake was a committed agent of the KGB, operating under the Soviet code name Diarmid. He returned to England in April 1953. SIS, far from suspecting him, treated him as something between a returning hero and a man deserving of institutional sympathy. He had endured 3 years of captivity in dreadful conditions. He had not broken, or so it appeared. The service gave him leave, a medical assessment, and then, with a haste that in retrospect beggars belief, a new posting. Blake was assigned to Section Y, the SIS department responsible for technical operations against the Soviet Union, based at Carlton Gardens. He was given access to files, operational plans, and, most critically, the identities of agents and informants working behind the Iron Curtain. The fox was not merely in the henhouse. He had been handed the keys and a list of every hen by name. By the autumn of 1953, Blake was settled into the rhythms of Carlton Gardens with a diligence that his colleagues found admirable and entirely unremarkable. He arrived early, worked late, and displayed a particular appetite for reading operational files that fell outside his immediate remit. In SIS culture of the period, this was interpreted as keenness rather than espionage. The service operated on trust, and Blake had earned it, or rather, he had survived an ordeal that functioned, in the institutional mind, as a substitute for earning it. His KGB handler in London was Sergei Kondrashev, a cultured and operationally sophisticated officer working under diplomatic cover at the Soviet embassy in Kensington Palace Gardens. The two men met at irregular intervals, typically in the quiet streets of suburban South London. Bromley, Bickley, the anonymous residential hinterland, where a man walking with purpose attracted no attention. Blake would carry documents concealed in a magazine or newspaper, passing them to Kondrashev during brief, choreographed encounters that rarely lasted more than a few minutes. The material he delivered was not photographed on site. Blake had access to the originals at Carlton Gardens and, with a confidence that bordered on recklessness, simply removed files, passed them to his handler, and returned them the following day. SIS had no document tracking system worthy of the name. There were no sign-out logs for classified material within the building. An officer of Blake's seniority could, and did, walk through the registry more or less at will. It was into this arrangement that Operation Gold arrived, or, as the British knew it, Operation Stopwatch. The plan was audacious. A joint SIS-CIA operation would dig a tunnel from the American sector of Berlin into the Soviet sector, tapping into underground telephone cables that carried Red Army and KGB communications between the Soviet military headquarters at Karlshorst and Moscow. The tunnel would run for approximately 300 meters beneath Schönefelder Chaussee, terminating in a purpose-built tap chamber where signals intelligence technicians would intercept and record thousands of telephone conversations and teleprinter messages daily. The intelligence yield, if the operation succeeded, would be immense, a direct window into Soviet military command traffic in the heart of occupied Germany. The concept originated with Peter Lunn, the SIS head of station in Vienna, who had already conducted a smaller-scale tunnel operation against Soviet communications in that city. The Berlin project was vastly more ambitious. Planning began in late 1953, with Frank Rowlett of the CIA and Tom Gimson of SIS overseeing the technical specifications. The tunnel required a cover building on the American side, a warehouse disguised as a radar intercept station, and sophisticated engineering to manage waterlogging, ventilation, and the considerable problem of disposing of approximately 3,000 tons of excavated soil without attracting Soviet attention. The Army Corps of Engineers handled the American construction effort. On the British side, the Post Office's specialist cable engineers were brought in to design the tap itself, a delicate piece of work that had to intercept signals on 3 separate cable bundles without introducing detectable impedance changes that might alert Soviet technicians conducting routine line tests. Blake knew about the tunnel from its earliest planning stages. He attended the joint SIS-CIA briefing at Carlton Gardens in late 1953, at which the operational concept was presented. He saw the diagrams. He knew the route, the target cables, and the projected intelligence take. And at his next meeting with Kondrashev, he told Moscow everything. The KGB now faced a dilemma of considerable operational subtlety. If they shut the tunnel down immediately or prevented its construction, they would reveal that they had a source with access to the most sensitive joint Anglo-American intelligence operations. The protection of Blake, codenamed Diomid, was paramount. Moscow Center, under the direction of KGB chairman Ivan Serov, made the calculated decision to allow the tunnel to be built and to permit it to operate. Soviet military communications would continue to flow through the tapped cables, feeding genuine intelligence to the Western analysts at Chester Terrace in London and the CIA's Processing Center in Washington. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, was not informed of the compromise. The KGB was content to let its institutional rivals' communications be hoovered up by the West, provided Blake remained undetected. The tunnel became operational on the 4th of May, 1955. For 11 months and 11 days, it intercepted an estimated 443,000 telephone conversations and over 6 million hours of teleprinter traffic. Western analysts worked through the material for years afterwards. Much of the intelligence was genuine and operationally valuable: Soviet order of battle information, logistics data, personnel movements, but all of it had been provided under conditions controlled, at the strategic level, by the KGB. The tunnel was, in the driest possible assessment, a success that was also a deception. On the 22nd of April, 1956, Soviet signals troops staged a carefully managed discovery of the tunnel, feigning outrage before the international press. Blake's cover remained intact. The tunnel was a spectacular operation, and its compromise was a spectacular intelligence failure. But it was not, in the final accounting, the worst of what George Blake did. The worst was quieter, more methodical, and carried a human cost that no quantity of intercepted telephone traffic could offset. Between 1953 and 1959, Blake identified and betrayed every Western agent and informant whose name crossed his desk. The number most commonly cited is 42. The true figure may be higher. Several of those betrayed were never heard from again. The mechanics of the betrayal were distressingly simple. SIS maintained files on its agents operating in East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the Soviet Union itself. These files contained real names, cover names, methods of communication, dead drop locations, and, in many cases, the personal circumstances that had led an individual to cooperate with British intelligence in the first place: a disaffected military officer, a scientist with family in the West, a party functionary who had seen too much. Each file represented a human being who had made the most dangerous decision available to a citizen of a police state: to work secretly against it. Blake read these files as part of his duties. He then passed their contents, systematically and without apparent hesitation, to Kondrashev and his successors. The KGB did not always act immediately on Blake's information. To arrest every compromised agent at once would have created the same problem as shutting down the Berlin Tunnel. It would have pointed unmistakably to a source within SIS Moscow Center, instead adopted a program of staggered neutralization. Some agents were arrested on pretexts unrelated to espionage, charged with economic crimes or political deviance, and sentenced to long terms in labor camps where their intelligence connections would never surface in open court. Others were placed under intensive surveillance, their networks mapped and then rolled up in a sequence designed to look like the natural result of competent KGB counterintelligence work. Rather than a single catastrophic penetration, a number were simply killed. The precise death toll attributable to Blake's betrayals has never been established, and almost certainly never will be. The KGB's operational files from this period remain largely closed. The East German Stasi archives, opened after reunification, contain fragments, references to agents who ceased transmitting, to informants who disappeared, but the connections are inferential rather than documentary. The figure most frequently cited in published accounts is that at least 5 of Blake's 42 identified agents were executed. Some intelligence historians, including the former SIS officer and author Nigel West, have suggested the number could be substantially higher. Among the known victims was a network of agents operating in East Germany under the direction of SIS's Berlin station, where Blake himself served from 1955 to 1959. This posting placed him in the extraordinary position of running agents whom he was simultaneously betraying. He would meet a source, debrief him, file a report to London, and then pass the source's identity to his KGB handler. The psychological compartmentalization required to sustain this double life over a period of years is difficult to comprehend from the outside. Blake himself, in later interviews, described it in terms that were notably devoid of anguish. He framed his actions as ideologically necessary, the service of a larger cause that rendered individual human consequences regrettable but acceptable. His Berlin posting also gave him access to the Western intelligence community's broader agent networks in the city. Berlin in the mid-1950s was the espionage capital of the world, a place where SIS, the CIA, French intelligence, and the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the West German Federal Intelligence Service under Reinhard Gehlen, operated in a tangle of overlapping and sometimes competing operations. Blake's position at the SIS station, located at the Olympic Stadium complex in the British sector, provided him with visibility not only into British operations but into joint operations with Allied services. Material he passed to Moscow compromised not merely SIS assets, but agents being run by partner agencies who had shared information with the British in good faith. The damage was cumulative and, for years, invisible. SIS knew that it was losing agents in Eastern Europe at an uncomfortable rate. Reports would go silent, dead drops would go unserviced. Sources who had been reliable for months or years would simply vanish. But the losses were attributed to the general hazards of operating against a competent security state. The KGB was good at its job. The Stasi, under Markus Wolf, was arguably better. Losing agents was the cost of doing business. Nobody at Carlton Gardens and nobody at the Berlin station connected the pattern to the quiet, diligent officer who read every file and never caused a moment's trouble. The system that had failed to vet Blake on recruitment now failed, with equal consistency, to detect him in operation. The intelligence that Blake passed to Moscow extended well beyond the names of individual agents. His position within SIS, and particularly his access during the critical years of the mid-1950s, gave the Soviet Union a window into NATO's strategic architecture that no satellite photograph or signals intercept could have provided. Blake delivered documents. Specifically, he delivered the documents that told Moscow how the Western alliance intended to fight. NATO's defense planning in this period was governed by a series of strategic concepts that evolved rapidly as the alliance absorbed the implications of Soviet nuclear capability. The Lisbon Force goals of 1952 had called for a conventional force of 96 divisions to defend Western Europe, a target that was never remotely achieved. By 1954, NATO had pivoted to the doctrine of massive retaliation, codified in Military Committee Document MC 14/2, which accepted that any major Soviet attack would be met with nuclear weapons. The practical consequence was that NATO's war plans for the Central European theatre, the disposition of the British Army of the Rhine, the deployment corridors for American reinforcements, the pre-designated nuclear release points, became the most sensitive documents in the Western military establishment. Blake had access to British assessments of these plans and passed what he saw to his handlers. The specific damage is difficult to quantify with precision because the British government has never published a comprehensive damage assessment. What is known, drawn from parliamentary statements, published intelligence histories, and the partial accounts of former officers, is that Blake compromised SIS reporting on NATO's order of battle for the Northern Army Group, which included the British Army of the Rhine and its assigned Belgian and Dutch formations. He provided Moscow with details of the alliance's signals intelligence program, including the disposition and function of intercept stations, such as those operated by the government communications headquarters at sites in West Germany. He passed material relating to British nuclear planning as it intersected with SIS's intelligence collection priorities, though the extent of his access to the most closely held nuclear targeting data, held by the Air Ministry and the Chiefs of Staff rather than by SIS, remains a matter of debate. What is not debatable is the strategic consequence. Soviet military planners, working from Blake's material and from the intelligence provided by other penetration agents across the Western Alliance, were able to construct a remarkably accurate picture of NATO's defensive posture. They knew where the divisions were. They knew the reinforcement timelines, they knew which communications links the alliance depended upon and where those links were vulnerable. Marshal Andrei Grechko, commanding the group of Soviet forces in Germany from 1953 to 1957, had access to an intelligence picture of his opponent that any military commander in history would have envied. The implications extended to the British nuclear deterrent itself. The RAF's V-bomber force, the Valiants, Victors, and Vulcans, operating from bases such as RAF Waddington, RAF Honington, and RAF Cottesmore, depended for its credibility on the Soviet Union's uncertainty about its operational plans. If Moscow knew the likely ingress routes, the target packages, and the electronic countermeasures available to Bomber Command, the deterrent calculus shifted. There is no direct evidence that Blake had access to V-Force targeting data, which was compartmented within the Air Ministry and not routinely shared with SIS. But he did have access to SIS assessments of Soviet air defense capabilities, assessments that, read in reverse, told Moscow precisely what the British knew and did not know about their own defensive systems. Blake was, in effect, handing the Soviet General Staff a mirror. They could see themselves as NATO saw them and adjust accordingly. The thread that unravelled George Blake did not originate in London, it came from Warsaw. In April 1959, a senior officer of the Polish intelligence service, the Urzon Bezpieczeństwa, made contact with the CIA through a dead drop in a park bench. His name was Michał Goleniewski, and he would prove to be one of the most consequential defectors of the Cold War, a man whose information was precise enough to be actionable but fragmentary enough to require months of painstaking cross-referencing before it yielded results. Goleniewski did not name Blake directly. What he provided was a series of indicators, details about a Soviet source within British intelligence who had access to Berlin station operations, who had been involved in a major technical operation against Soviet communications, and who had been recruited during a period of captivity in the Far East. The indicators were shared with SIS through the established CIA-SIS liaison channel, and they landed on the desk of Terence Leckie, then heading SIS's counterintelligence section. Leckie and his colleagues began the grim work of matching Goleniewski's fragments against the service's own personnel records. The process was slow, partly by necessity and partly because SIS was institutionally reluctant to confront the possibility of another penetration. The Philby affair, which had erupted in 1951 and continued to poison the service's reputation throughout the decade, had left deep scars. The notion that SIS harbored yet another Soviet mole, a second catastrophic failure of vetting and internal security, was not one that the service's leadership welcomed. Dick White, who had moved from the directorship of MI5 to take charge of SIS in 1956, was acutely aware of the political consequences. Another scandal on the scale of Philby would call into question the very competence of the organization. Nevertheless, the indicators pointed with increasing specificity toward Blake. By the spring of 1961, the circle had narrowed sufficiently for SIS to act. Blake was at that time posted to the Middle East Center for Arabic Studies in Shemlan, Lebanon, the same language school that Philby had attended, an irony that would not have been lost on anyone involved. He was recalled to London on a pretext, summoned to Carlton Gardens, and on the 4th of April, 1961, escorted into a room where Harold Shergold and Terence Leckie were waiting. What happened in that room over the following 3 days remains one of the most remarked upon episodes in British intelligence history. Shergold, an experienced interrogator, did not adopt an aggressive posture. He presented Blake with the indicators calmly, methodically, without accusation. He allowed silences to develop. He offered tea. The approach was, by the standards of intelligence interrogation, almost conversational, and on the third day Blake confessed, not partially, not with reservations, but comprehensively. He admitted to working for the KGB since his captivity in Korea. He admitted to betraying the Berlin Tunnel. He admitted to compromising agents. He described his motives as ideological and expressed no remorse. The confession astonished those who heard it, not because of its content, which by that stage was largely anticipated, but because of its tone. Blake spoke with a detachment that several witnesses later described as chilling. There was no breakdown, no pleading, no attempt at justification beyond a flat assertion that he believed in the communist cause and had acted in accordance with that belief. Shergold later remarked privately that it was the most unsettling interrogation of his career, not because of resistance, but because of its absence. Blake had simply decided that the game was finished and proceeded to lay every card on the table with the composure of a man settling an overdue account. He was formally arrested and charged under Section 1 of the Official Secrets Act 1911. Blake's trial opened on the 3rd of May, 1961, at the Old Bailey, before the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Parker of Waddington. The proceedings were held almost entirely in camera, the public gallery cleared, the press excluded, the specifics of the charges heard behind closed doors on grounds of national security. The open portions of the trial lasted less than a single day. Blake pleaded guilty to 5 charges under the Official Secrets Act. His counsel, Jeremy Hutchinson, later Baron Hutchinson of Lullington, offered a plea in mitigation that stressed Blake's Korean captivity, the psychological pressures of prolonged internment, and the absence of any financial motive. Blake had never taken money from the KGB. His betrayal, Hutchinson argued, was ideological, the product of a genuine, if catastrophically misguided, political conviction. Lord Parker was unmoved. He sentenced Blake to 42 years imprisonment, the longest sentence ever handed down by a British court for a charge not carrying the death penalty. The number was widely interpreted, both at the time and since, as precisely calibrated. 1 year for each of the agents Blake had exposed. Lord Parker himself never confirmed this arithmetic publicly, but the symbolism was unmistakable and was reported as such in the following day's press. The sentence was intended to signal, with maximum severity, that the British state regarded the betrayal of human sources as a crime of an altogether different order from the passing of documents or technical intelligence. Blake had not merely leaked secrets, he had, in the court's evident view, signed death warrants. Blake was sent to Wormwood Scrubs, the Victorian prison in Hammersmith, that also housed, at various times, several other convicted spies, including Gordon Lonsdale and the Portland spy ring members. He was a model prisoner, quiet, cooperative, and apparently resigned to spending the remainder of his productive life behind bars. He was not resigned. Within 2 years of his arrival, he had begun cultivating a relationship with Sean Bourke, an Irish petty criminal serving a sentence for sending a homemade bomb through the post to a police officer. Bourke was charismatic, reckless, and possessed of exactly the kind of anti-establishment temperament that Blake needed. The escape took place on the evening of the 22nd of October, 1966. Blake broke a window on a landing at the rear of D Hall, climbed down a rope ladder made from size 13 knitting needles and nylon cord, dropped onto a flat roof, and scrambled over the outer wall where Bourke was waiting with a getaway car. The operation had been facilitated by 2 peace activists, Michael Randall and Pat Pottle, who had befriended Blake through the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament network that ran through the prison's visiting channels. Randall and Pottle were not Soviet agents. They were idealists who believed Blake's sentence was disproportionate and who were prepared to break the law to correct what they saw as an injustice. Their involvement would not become public for over 2 decades. Blake was driven to a safe house in Highbury, North London, where he remained hidden for approximately 2 months, while the Metropolitan Police conducted one of the largest manhunts in post-war British history. The search focused on ports, airports, and the Kent coast. Blake was 17 miles from Scotland Yard. In January 1967, he was smuggled out of England in a specially modified camper van, concealed in a hidden compartment behind a panel, driven by Randall through Dover, across the Channel, and through West Germany to the East German border. He crossed into communist territory and was driven to East Berlin, where the KGB received him. Within days, he was in Moscow. The embarrassment to the British government was acute, and it was permanent. Moscow received George Blake with the controlled warmth that the Soviet state reserved for its most useful defectors. He was given a flat on the Arbat, a KGB pension, and, in time, a second wife. A Soviet woman named Ida, with whom he had a son. He was awarded the Order of Friendship and, according to some accounts, the Order of Lenin, though the latter has never been conclusively verified in open sources. He settled into the curious half-life of the Western defector in the Soviet Union, celebrated in official propaganda, occasionally paraded before sympathetic journalists, but fundamentally irrelevant to the intelligence apparatus that had once depended on him. A spent asset, honorably retired. He gave interviews, he wrote his memoir, No Other Choice, published in 1990, in which he presented his espionage career as the logical consequence of a sincere political conversion. The book is fluent, articulate, and almost entirely self-serving. Blake never expressed remorse for the agents he had compromised. He acknowledged their existence in the abstract but declined to engage with their individual fates, retreating instead into the language of historical necessity. The people he had named were casualties of a larger struggle, regrettable but unavoidable, in much the same way that a general might regret civilian casualties without accepting personal culpability. It was a position that those who knew the dead and the imprisoned found obscene. The damage assessment, meanwhile, remained a live concern in Whitehall for decades. The full scope of Blake's betrayal was never presented to Parliament in any comprehensive form. Dick White, who bore institutional responsibility as chief of SIS during the period of Blake's exposure and arrest, worked to contain the political fallout, and the Macmillan government had no appetite for a public inquiry that would inevitably invite comparison with the Philby catastrophe. The Roma Committee, convened under Sir Charles Roma in 1961 to review security procedures within the intelligence services in the wake of several espionage cases, addressed systemic failures in vetting and internal security, but did not publish a detailed accounting of the operational losses attributable to Blake specifically. What can be reconstructed from the available record is grim enough. At least 42 agents compromised, an unknown number executed. The Berlin Tunnel, a joint operation that cost millions of pounds and represented the most ambitious technical intelligence operation of the early Cold War, rendered a controlled exercise from its inception. NATO defense planning for the Central European theatre exposed to Soviet analysis during a period of acute strategic vulnerability. The credibility of SIS as a competent partner within the Western intelligence alliance severely damaged, with consequences for Anglo-American intelligence sharing that persisted well into the 1970s. Blake outlived the state he had served. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. He remained in Moscow, an elderly man in a changed city, sustained by his pension and by occasional visits from Russian intelligence officials who regarded him as a relic of a heroic era. He died on the 26th of December, 2020, at the age of 98. The SVR, successor to the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, issued a statement praising his courage and his service. The British government said nothing. In the end, the case of George Blake raises questions that Whitehall has preferred to leave unanswered. How many of the 42 died? What were their names? What did their families know? And when? The files that might answer these questions remain classified, locked in the archives of the Secret Intelligence Service at Vauxhall Cross, subject to review dates that extend decades into the future. The agents Blake betrayed served the West in secret. They died, or suffered, in secret. And the full truth of what was done to them remains, to this day, a secret still.